is they've done well in the past, they've had a lot of tailwinds behind them. Any and all of these potential risks could come to pass. If they do, that does undermine the investment case to some degree. All
right, look, we do have to take another break. When we come back, Stephen Roberts, Chief Economist at Laminar, joins us for a bit of a chat on the economy. Stay with us.
The world abounds with many delights, magical sights, fanciful flights, and those who dream on beautiful nights dream of beautiful things. The world is full of beautiful things, beautiful people too, beautiful people like you.
Car accident was on the 1st of December.
It was almost like watching one of the medical shows. It was her laying on her side in a hospital bed.
Mum and Dad said to us, you know, you've got your income protection, you should use it. It's not a lengthy process, the money's there straight away when you need it. Having that stable amount coming in every month, you can just concentrate on getting better and knowing it's going to be there.
Call Insurance Line on 13 25 65 or search Great Aussies now.
Trivago finds you hotels for the best price. Just search where you want to go and Trivago instantly compares prices from over 150 websites. With Trivago, you can be sure to find the ideal hotel for the best price. Hotel Trivago.
Coming August 18, Arena celebrates the best of Australian stage.
Welcome to the Helpman Awards.
For one special night, watch Australia's biggest live performances, featuring Strictly Ballroom the Musical, The King and I, and Les Miserables. The 14th Annual Helpman Awards, coming August 18, exclusively on Arena.
Tonight on Paul Murray Live, it's the photo that's got the country talking, but there's an even darker story behind it. Plus, was anyone actually convinced by Gammy's parents last night? I wasn't. And all the day's politics with Richo and Ross Campbell. Must watch TV tonight, only on Sky News.
On the rebound, the local market snaps a losing streak. JB Hi-Fi, though, not that lucky, ending the day down about 7.9%. On the up, Bendigo and Adelaide leading the bank's high today after strong earnings driven by margin improvements. Competitive tension, Treasury wine shares thrive on the back of another takeover offer. This one believed to be from private equity firm TPG.
This is Market Day.
Welcome back to the program. Let's take a quick look at how we did finish this Monday session. What is happening regionally? Positive one in the end. Off the highs, though, up 21.5 points, 5,457. An increase in the end, 0.4%. A little bit disappointing when compared to the rest of the region. The Nikkei up about 2.4%. Some good moves out of the Hong Kong as well. The Hang Seng up about 1.25%. And you can see the composite out of Shanghai doing very well, up over 30 points. Speaking of China's annual inflation rose 2.3% in July. The stable read remains well below the 3.5% annual target set by the government back in March. Overall, food prices drove inflation, rising 3.6% from the same month last year, according to the official data. I want to bring in Stephen Roberts, Chief Economist over at Laminar, and we'll talk about China in just a moment. Before we do, the RBA, the centre of a lot of macro conversations at the moment, Stephen, very much as to what is the likely next move. After the last CPI, it seemed there was no chance of them cutting, but then that shock unemployment read.
Yeah, I think we take that in context of what they said on Friday too, when they issued their latest forecasts. And what they've done, I think quite credibly, is they've just trimmed their view of growth in Australia over the next year or so. And they've also taken a little bit out of the inflation rate too, which may seem a little odd after the higher than expected underlying reading. But you know, I think it's warranted. We saw those labour force data going back to Thursday, and it's not the 1 month figure, it's where it's been going over this last 2 or 3 months. And quite clearly, the labour market's a lot weaker than where it was first thing in the year, and will take longer to get out of that weak phase. So I think it's warranted that the Reserve Bank is less concerned about inflation. And what it implies for rates is well, they're probably going to leave them low for longer. Whether they can ease again, I think that's a difficult one because the market's doing a bit of easing for them. So I'm not sure they want to add to that momentum.
So you don't see, because people are talking about it, a couple of conversations, different conversations over the weekend with people who are adamant they're going to cut.
Yeah, I think it's probably unlikely, and it's because the banks themselves are offering lower interest rates. We're getting a de facto easing without the Reserve Bank actually adding to the process. And I'm sure we'll get more of that de facto easing if they leave rates unchanged for, say, the next year. And so there's not a need, really, for the Reserve Bank to add to that, particularly given that we've got momentum in parts of the economy, such as housing.
You'd hate to see it, wouldn't you, Scott? Another cut?
Yeah, look, I think... I say a lot, James, and this is the case. RBA are planning 12 and 18 months out. Now, they're going to react, and they need to react to any short-term problems that seem to upset the apple cart. They've got a long-term view. Then I said, look, our job is to get the economy in track. We know that the interest rates really don't take effect for at least 6 months. When the cut is done, it really takes that long to get through to the real economy. So whatever they're doing now is going to happen, is going to impact, February, March next year, not September, October. That's the key challenge, and I think if and Stephen points out very, very accurately, the labour force challenge is the real challenge confronting the RBA, and the real rogue number, if it is a rogue number. If it's a real number, if it does become part of a longer-term trend, then the RBA maybe do have to have a rationale to cut. I think it would be bad news for the longer-term health of our economy. The longer rates are low, the more chance there is we're going to create bubbles further down the track. But the RBA is right, as was the US Fed, to deal with the real issues right now if it needs to be dealt with, and then worry about it. If you're going to dig a hole, you might as well dig a deep one, get it right now, and then move it down the track and try and get it fixed. If it does happen, I think the RBA will only do if it's absolutely necessary. But if it is necessary, it's going to signal the potential for bigger and longer-term problems down the track.
Do you get the sense, Stephen, that they don't want to cut, that they, if anything, they would like to see rates moving higher, I suppose, because it would be a reflection of a stronger economy?
Well, I get the sense that naturally at this stage of the cycle they'll be thinking towards a period when interest rates start to normalise. What's stopping that is the rebalancing of the economy. It's in fits and starts, and we've just got a softer patch for the time being running through the labour force, and they don't have any pressing pressures to start that normalisation just yet. And I entirely agree that there's a lag before whatever they do starts to impact on the economy. So I think they've got quite a bit of time ahead of them where they can leave rates exactly where they are, watch the data as it's coming through. We've got some evidence that the US is doing well. We've got evidence that China's showing some signs of better growth through the second half of this year than through the very beginning part of this year. So they can afford to watch these developments for quite a while before they need to touch rates.
What do you see as the key factor that would see them move? Is it the jobs rate?
I don't necessarily think it's the jobs rate. You'd have to see a general labour force or labour market improvement, including in wages growth. And that's the other part of this story. We've got very soft wages growth at the moment. Wages are actually growing on an annual basis below the CPI. It's not often you see real wages declining slightly in Australia. So that's a bit of a problem in itself as well for keeping demand going as we go down the track. A lot of those things have got to wear their way through before the Reserve Bank will comfortably start that process of normalising rates.
We get the NAB business survey tomorrow. We've seen increases, albeit marginal increases in terms of sentiment and conditions, and yet we got that 6.4% read in terms of unemployment. What are you expecting from the NAB business survey tomorrow?
Well, it's always a difficult one to call, but I think businesses are on the cusp of taking a slightly more optimistic view about things. And we've seen that with the way in which that index has been moving over the course of the last month or two, notwithstanding the federal budget back in May. The NAB business survey actually held up pretty well through the budget. It was consumer sentiment that pulled back quite sharply, but even some of the indicators of consumer sentiment are actually showing some signs of just starting to lift. But we need to see a lot more of that, and so employment is always one of those lagging indicators. So in some ways what happened to employment is not really a reflection of what businesses are going to be saying now about what's going to be happening in the future.
What do you see as the key concerns for business? I mean, a lot of people talk about the political landscape still, in particular, the passage of the budget or the passage of any sort of legislation through a rather tricky Senate.
I think the uncertainty around how these things go through the Senate is difficult for businesses to deal with. Businesses react far better when you get a certain amount of certainty about government policy, and obviously that's going to be difficult in the parliament we've got for the time being. So that's definitely a complicating factor. I think as far as business is concerned, though, they want to see some consistency in demand for their products coming through, whether that be from overseas or whether that be here locally. And both of them have been a little bit problematic. It's looking a little bit better actually overseas than here. And in amongst that, of course, you've got the currency, which has held up stronger for longer than people would have anticipated, although encouragingly over the last few weeks it's just starting to show some signs of peeling back.
I don't want to linger on politics. It sort of tends to be better handled on the news channel, but it's something that is constantly being referred to when we're talking about business confidence or a lack thereof.
Yeah, and look, Stephen mentioned the certainty of demand. That's effectively consumer confidence, and that really is what took a hit from the federal budget. We saw directly after the budget, we saw companies citing the federal budget, those that were either not politically connected or just simply want to call it as they saw it, or maybe were looking for excuses. But businesses come out and say, look, the federal budget was an impact, and that really did, I think, set consumer confidence back 3 or 6 months. The uncertainty in the Senate, I think, is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think it's bad news for business. Again, as Stephen mentioned, business investment, they want certainty. They want to know what's going to happen. On the flip side, anything that keeps those cuts from actually coming through and gives consumers a bigger gap between what they saw as the budget outcomes and the passing of that legislation, probably gives the electorate and then consumers a reason to keep spending, to actually kind of almost put more distance between themselves and that. And that's really the key one is, are consumers spending? Are businesses getting the benefit of that? This earnings season, a bit mixed, to be honest, in terms of some of the retail consumer discretionary businesses. We've seen some spending, we've seen some come back. We talked about JB Hi-Fi earlier in the show. Great results for last year. July and August, they're not so great. Maybe that's technology related, maybe that's consumers in general. It is going to be consumer confidence and the consumer spending quite specifically that's going to impact business hiring decisions, because that's where the multiplier goes right through the economy. From the dollar you spend today, that gets spent 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 times right through the economy. If they're not spending that dollar, that's really going to retard growth. If they can get the money out there, that is really going to help businesses feel confident enough to go and hire. They hire more people, that puts more money in the economy, and that virtuous circle really does take hold. Well,
Stephen, I suppose then that sets up a very interesting couple of reads on Wednesday with consumer confidence from Westpac and, of course, a backward-looking Q2 wages figure.
Well, it does, and I think as far as consumer confidence is concerned, we've seen some of the newer weekly surveys of consumer sentiment have picked up quite a bit over the course of the past month, recovering much of that loss that occurred around the period of the budget. We haven't seen that yet in the monthly Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Index, so I'm hopeful that we might see a little bit more of that in the reading that we get coming out on Wednesday, and it might catch up with some of those weekly readings. As far as wages are concerned, though, that still looks pretty soft. I'd be surprised if we see anything better than another 0.7% quarter on quarter, and that leaves us stuck around about on the cusp between about 2.6 and 2.7% year on year. Now remember, the last CPI was 3, so we've still got real wages actually declining.
Indeed. Look, on that note, we do have to leave it there, but as always, Stephen Roberts, great to get your analysis. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, David Murray's interim report is coming under fire from the Australian Bankers Association. It says the financial system inquiry got it wrong when it found Australian banks should hold around the same amount of equity as their global peers. ABA CEO Stephen Munchenberg says assumptions in the report, such as housing posing a systemic risk, could come back to bite the banks in the future. For more, Brooke Cordy and Carson Scott spoke with Mr Munchenberg.
The interim report of the inquiry came out and said that Australia's banks are capitalised to the equivalent about the middle of the pack internationally. Now that's inconsistent with what we, and I believe the regulator's been saying for some time, which is that Australia's banks are in fact amongst the best capitalised in the world. This is a very complex area. We're not actually being critical of the inquiry. This is a complex, detailed area. And we just think we need to be able to put to the inquiry a more thorough and better analysis, which will show that we are actually better capitalised than they've concluded in the interim report.
In layman's terms, how would you describe kind of the missing link, I suppose, between what you've said, even the regulators have said in the past, and now what this inquiry has said?
Look, unfortunately, it's just one of those very complicated areas. A lot of the data that's about capitalisation levels is available only to the regulator and to the banks. I think that the inquiry has attempted to capture all of that, but it's a lot more complicated than perhaps they've realised. And what we need to do is simply show the actual calculation in detail and show that Australia's banks are in fact very well capitalised.
So would APRA not have made a submission with its data that you have access to the Financial System Inquiry though? Or?
Well, I'm not aware that APRA sort of had input into the particular calculation. I mean, they may have, but I'm not aware that that's the case. And look, it's incumbent on us now to be able to demonstrate that the calculation, when done with more detail, actually shows that we are better capitalised than this initial finding has suggested.
Steve, UBS, as you'd be aware, has made comment on this, at least this interim report, and it's of the view, as you know, that given, quote, solid returns on equity and elevated multiples, the banks look well positioned to absorb additional capital buffers. So if that's their analysis as estimating what may be required, which is as much as 23 billion raised to meet these new requirements, presumably it's not really going to be lights out.
Well, look, we're not suggesting that. I mean, what we do need to do is make sure that when we are talking about the capital requirements of Australia's banks, we have a correct and agreed basis for that conversation, and we're not there yet, and that's why we're doing some additional work to get there. We've also recognised that, you know, one of the lessons out of the GFC is that banks around the world, not just Australia's banks, need to be well capitalised. Ours were through the GFC. We didn't actually have to touch our capital to deal with the GFC. But there has to be a line drawn somewhere as well. I mean, we can have endless amounts of capital. That'll lead to more and more stability, but as someone has once said, you know, the safest car in the world is the one that doesn't move. How much capital do we actually need, and at what cost is that capital going to impose on the whole system?
Do we need to be more prudent, especially prudent, given, I mean, it's something pointed out by Chris Joy in the AFR today, talking about the fact that, you know, we're a capital importing nation. We run persistent current account deficits via the major banks. So this is why maybe this is being, you know, looked at so closely. We should actually be more prudent than the overseas institutions.
Well, look, I think we do need to keep this in perspective. I mean, we just, a few years ago, went through the biggest financial system shock that the world has seen in over 70 years, and Australian banks didn't even need to touch their capital. They were well managed. The government of the day did a very good job in supporting the banks at the time. And the regulators have done a very good job. So we've got to take all that into account. Since that time, we've added a lot more capital as well. So I think we need, when calling for even further capital, we need to look at what the actual facts are and the situation to date and how much capital we've already added.
Just walk us through some sense of time frame as well, if you could, on all of this now. There's a second submission, is there not, that's been called for as soon as inside this month?
Well, that's right. The interim report came out in the middle of last month, and we've got towards the end of this month to put submissions in. So we're working very hard at the moment to make sure that we can respond to a very wide range of issues that the Murray inquiry has so far raised.
And what in that submission, what are the objections you're raising to the finding that housing's a significant source of systemic risk for the banks? Detail that part of the submission to us.
Well, we're not so much challenging that. We just want to make sure that when statements like that are made, there is context around them. So the regulators, APRA and the RBA, are very well aware of the exposure that Australian banks do have to the housing sector. There's a whole host of reasons for that, and the point that I expect that we will be making will be that while there may be some risks in that, they are very actively managed by both the regulators and the banks. So we need to keep these things in context and perspective.
Do you worry that retail deposits only make about 60% of the value of loans, that other 40% is wholesale funding and shareholder cash? That is quite a movable feast, as you'd appreciate, the latter component. Do you worry about that composition?
Well, look, we've actually seen the level of deposit funding increase significantly. So back before the GFC, it stood around 40%. It's now up to almost 60%. So for regulatory reasons, under market pressure and for prudent reasons, banks have significantly increased their deposit holdings to fund their activities. But the reality is that Australia is a capital importing country, and we are always going to need to do that.
I'm just worrying, the retail deposits, though, themselves have an average duration of less than 6 months. Now, that presumably exposes Australian banks and taxpayers by extension to systemic risk.
I'm not quite sure why you say that in terms of, I suppose, in terms of a liquidity risk, but I think the reality is that depositors do see Australian banks and the whole system as very safe. Obviously, deposits up to $250,000 have the government guarantee there for the benefit of the depositors. So there's a whole range of measures that are put in place, and this is one of the reasons why we're one of the most regulated industries in Australia.
Time for a quick break. Coming up across live to Bloomberg in Hong Kong. Kismet Singh standing by for her thoughts on the session around the region today.